how can society make it any different? How can you make it any different? You put some people in a shelter or something like that there, you're in, you gotta go to bed by 8 o'clock at night, you gotta be up by 6 in the morning. Well, what are you gonna do? Head them up, hurry them up, rawhide, kind of shit. Affordable housing,
60 pages long or so. A scholar, he's written a lot on homelessness, and Dr. Wang came forth and was wonderful to deal with, and basically wrote an expert report, which was before the court. We had expert evidence from an outdoors expert, a wilderness guide who trains for people in first aid and is also a paramedic. And we had evidence from him around what the impacts would be of people sleeping in this climate outdoors without shelter from the elements. So the evidence before the court, there was a lot about the impacts on people's health and safety and why this was so important. So that kind of evidence, along with many studies that had been produced by the province, commissioned by the province, the city, mostly government publications or endorsed studies were before the court, and along with the evidence of many, many homeless people. So with that history, needless to say, we were tenuously walking into court in the middle of June, thinking what could possibly happen this time. We were really going to go, and we did finally have the hearing heard. So the arguments were made over 4 days before Madam Justice Ross in Vancouver, and I'm going to turn the mic over to Kathy and let Kathy tell you about that hearing, about what our arguments were, and what her ladyship ruled, and that will hopefully give you kind of the meaning of what this judgment addresses and what it says. Okay, thank you.
Everybody okay if I stay sitting down? The only correction I'd make, Irene, is we did it in Victoria. You said Vancouver.
Oh.
Just so nobody's confused. We're in Victoria. I think one thing that's just to supplement what Irene said about the history, when we said that Mr. Justice Stewart at the beginning felt he was bound by precedent to issue the initial injunction, we made the argument before him that what always happened in these cases is that people came together and you had a tent city, and people had some resources as a result. They had a place to stay, they could save some of their energy, they could talk and support each other, and as a result they could manage to find some counsel and put some evidence together and try and resist an injunction. What then sort of inevitably was never being addressed. And this is really one of the first cases, if not the first case in Canada, to talk about the impact of laws on people who don't have any money, or who have very limited resources, or who are living in very, very difficult circumstances. And that's for a very, a reason that's no mystery. It's really hard to go to court. And if you don't have a place to sleep and you don't have a place to keep your stuff, how are you going to be able to conduct a lawsuit? So it's, one of the things we're going to talk about later is this may be the beginning of many more cases that will sort of thresh out exactly what the Section 7 right is. But you can't expect people to have to take on too many of those cases. People just, it's not fair. So, I would expect that, I'm not speaking, entirely as a lawyer here, but when you ask your city councilors what they're going to do, they should do more than the Constitution requires them to do, right? I mean, the Constitution is a very blunt instrument. And we'll tell you what the case means, in our view, and we think it means a lot, but it doesn't by any means define what people should do, just as what they have to do, right? And further cases will define other things that they have to do. You can only do so much at once, but Don't let them get away with just that. So, I think we had a very good hearing from Madam Justice Ross. She listened to all of our evidence, and she paid a lot of attention to a great deal of background evidence, and Irene's already been through a lot of that. She listened to the evidence about the number of people who were without shelter here in Victoria, about the number of shelter beds, about some of the difficulties with the shelters, about the conditions that people face when they're on the street, because you hear a lot of stuff about crime and homelessness, but what you don't always hear is that homeless people are, more often than not, the victims of the crime, right? I think the statistics from Toronto or something like a homeless man is 9 times more likely to be murdered than somebody with accommodation. Something like 20% of homeless women in Toronto had been raped within the past year. And as Irene mentioned, one of the things about the tent city was that it provided a lot of safety, especially for the younger women who were there, who don't have very good opportunities for shelter spaces here in Victoria. So Madam Justice Ross listened to all that evidence. She listened to our expert evidence. Our expert evidence from Dr. Stephen Wang was that it was clear that in the climate we have in Victoria, if people were prevented, there will be serious and significant health consequences. Now, she didn't decide, the judge didn't decide whether or not people should sleep in public spaces outside. She found that in Victoria, people will be sleeping in public spaces outside. There's just simply no choice. Some people may choose to. For many people, there's no choice. Of the people who use shelters, the latest homeless needs survey, I think, said that 80% of them had been turned away from shelters, and the most common reason for being turned away was that the shelters were full. But she also recognized that there's problems with the shelters in some respects as well. So she didn't say people should sleep outside. She said people will sleep outside. And given that they don't have any choice whether or not to sleep outside, really the question before her was, when they're sleeping outside, should they be able to erect some form of shelter for themselves? Now, it's hard to see how she could have come to any different conclusion than she did. You know, I mean, she looked at the city's reasons for saying they had to have this prohibition. And all the reasons that they said they didn't want to have people erecting shelter were really about not having people sleeping outside, right? It was all about, we don't really want homeless people around, but they're here. Homeless people are here, and given if you start from that proposition, the only question is, are they allowed to make themselves safe and secure and provide themselves with some measure of dignity and maybe even privacy? And that's what she addressed. So she made a finding of fact that there were significantly more homeless people in Victoria than there were spaces in the shelters. She made a finding of fact that the expert evidence had established that preventing people from erecting shelter would have serious and significant impacts on their health. And on the basis of those factual findings, she concluded that it was a breach of Section 7 of the Charter to prevent them from erecting shelter of some kind. Section 7 says that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, and not to be deprived of those things except in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice. So when you're a Section 7 claimant, as we were in this case, we had to prove that there was a deprivation of either life or liberty or security of the person. And she found that there was a deprivation of all three in this case. She found that it was a deprivation of security of the person because it could cause you significant harm, deprivation of life because it deprived you of shelter, which was